I wasn't supposed to be at my sister's party, but my parents insisted. They called me earlier in the week saying she'd be upset if I didn't show up. We'd had a falling out after she moved back home post-college, but my parents were determined to keep the peace. They told me that just making an appearance would mend fences. I arrived late, hoping to slip in, greet her, and leave without much drama. The house was packed with her college friends, blasting music, dancing in the living room, and crowding the hallway. I recognized almost nobody. My sister Abby spotted me from the top of the staircase the moment I stepped through the door. She waved me over, leaning against the banister with a plastic cup in hand. I'd planned to stay polite, maybe even talk a bit about her new job prospects. But the minute I was within arm's reach, she grinned like she was up to something. She grabbed my shoulder and said, "Guess you're not too cool to celebrate after all, huh?" Then, before I could answer, she shoved me. Hard. My body tumbled down the stairs, and that's the last thing I remember before I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital with a splitting headache, a cast around my left arm, and several stitches over my eyebrow. The nurse told me I had a concussion, a fractured wrist, and severe bruising along my spine. My parents hovered near the bed, looking furious. Not at Abby, but at me. My mother hissed, "It was an accident. She didn't mean any harm." My father chimed in, "Don't blow this out of proportion. She pushed you playfully and you lost your balance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The doctor came in, explained my injuries, and asked if I remembered what happened. I told him the truth, that Abby shoved me. He asked for details, and my parents shot me a warning glare. They wanted me to keep quiet, but I had no intention of lying. Their reaction made something snap inside me. I realized how deeply they favored Abby and how little they cared about my well-being. Once the doctor stepped out, my father whispered, "We can't afford a scandal. Don't even think about pressing charges. Just let this go." A heaviness settled in my chest. I knew I couldn't let Abby get away with nearly crippling me. My parents left the hospital soon after, saying they had to take care of Abby. Apparently, her party had ended in chaos once everyone realized I was bleeding at the bottom of the staircase. The nurse told me an ambulance was called by a concerned friend of Abby's, not by my parents. That hurt more than any broken bone. I was stuck in that bed, cycling between anger and heartbreak. I kept replaying the push in my mind, wondering if I could have prevented it. Maybe I should have stood farther from her. Maybe I should have seen her grin as a warning. The reality was that Abby wanted to humiliate me, and she didn't care about the consequences. On the second day of my hospital stay, I got a call from my best friend, Dylan. He asked what happened, and I told him everything. He listened, furious on my behalf, and offered to help me in any way he could. I said I didn't know what the next step would be, but inside, I knew exactly what I wanted: justice, or maybe something closer to revenge. I refused to let her walk away scot-free this time. After I was discharged, I went back to my small apartment and tried to settle into normal life again. But everything felt different. My left wrist ached, my head still spun when I stood up too quickly, and I was taking painkillers that made me groggy. My boss gave me a week of medical leave, which I used to plot my next move. Abby hadn't bothered to apologize. Instead, she sent me a text reading, "Sorry you fell. Hope you recover fast." It was the most infuriating line I'd ever seen. She refused to take responsibility for what she did. My parents called once, telling me to think about the family's reputation. They implied I'd lose my future inheritance if I pressed charges or made a scene. That phone call shattered any lingering illusions I had about my parents' neutrality. They were solidly on Abby's side. I knew they'd cover for her. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was determined to stand up for myself. The question was how far I was willing to go. A part of me still feared losing my parents' love, but another part was so angry I didn't care anymore. I wanted payback. I spoke with a lawyer, recommended by Dylan's aunt, who specialized in personal injury cases. She listened patiently as I described the incident and showed her my medical reports. She said I had a solid case if I chose to pursue criminal charges for assault. However, she warned me that cases involving family can get messy fast. She was open about the potential fallout. My parents might retaliate, Abby could lawyer up, and the whole thing might drag out. I told her I needed time to think, but she could tell I was leaning toward pressing charges. Before I left her office, She suggested I document every interaction I had with Abby or my parents moving forward. That night, I stared at my phone, rereading my parents' text messages. They were all about maintaining silence and keeping the family image intact. No remorse, no concern for my health, just pressure to protect Abby. The more I saw their words, the clearer my path became. I decided I wouldn't let them manipulate me. I was through being the scapegoat. I called the lawyer again and said I wanted to move forward. She promised to guide me through every step, no matter how messy. Once the legal process began, Abby and my parents panicked. I heard from my mother first, screaming into the phone that I was tearing the family apart. She ended the call by warning me I'd get nothing from them when they passed away. I hung up, shaking with rage, but weirdly, I also felt a strange sense of relief. I was no longer bound by the carrot of an inheritance. Abby texted me next. She wrote, "Are you serious? It was just a joke, you drama queen. Drop this or I'll make your life miserable." That message confirmed everything I already knew. She was unapologetic, unafraid, and expected me to bow to her whims. Dylan came over that night, bringing me dinner and helping me draft out a statement of events for the lawyer. We spent hours dissecting every detail, making sure we had times, places, and witnesses who saw Abby shove me. A couple of her former friends quietly reached out with messages of support, saying they never liked how she treated me. That gave me more confidence. I wasn't alone, and people were finally seeing her for who she really was. My case was starting to solidify around me. While waiting for the formal legal process to unfold, I realized I wanted more than just a conviction. I wanted Abby to taste the fear and isolation I'd felt my entire life, overshadowed by her popularity and our parents' favoritism. I'd never stooped to her level before, but something in me had snapped. I started reaching out to old friends and acquaintances of Abby's, collecting stories of all the pranks she used to play. Turns out, my push down the stairs wasn't the first time she seriously injured someone. Back in high school, she made a girl fall off the bleachers during a pep rally by yanking her ponytail. The girl broke her ankle, and Abby got off with detention because she claimed it was an accident. The more I heard, the angrier I became. My sister had a history of hurting people and skating by with minimal consequences. My parents always covered for her, donating money to the school or pulling strings to protect her record. I decided if they wanted a war, I'd give them one. I began compiling statements from people she'd victimized or bullied. My lawyer said this could help show a pattern of behavior. I was determined to make sure Abby faced every consequence she deserved. My parents ramped up the pressure, bombarding me with phone calls and text messages. My father even showed up unannounced at my apartment, insisting we talk. He sat on my couch, scanning the cluttered living room as though searching for a weak spot. He finally said, "Look, we've invested a lot in you, paid your tuition, helped with your car. This is how you repay us? Dragging your sister through the mud?" I felt something cold settle over me. I responded that Abby physically assaulted me, and I was done protecting her. He offered me a deal, dropped the charges, and he'd set aside a nice sum for me in his will. I refused. He stormed out, shouting that I was no son of his anymore. After he left, I felt the sting of those words, but also a sense of freedom. No more guilt, no more hiding the truth. I called Dylan and told him everything that happened. He reiterated he had my back. The walls were closing in on Abby and my parents, and I was determined to see this through. My sister had no idea how ready I was to fight back. Nothing and no one would stop me this time. About a month after I filed charges, we had our first court hearing. Abby arrived with a smug look, flanked by my parents and her lawyer. I watched her exchange whispers with them, completely unfazed. My lawyer spoke on my behalf, detailing my injuries and presenting initial evidence. Abby's lawyer argued it was an accident, that I was exaggerating, and that witnesses saw me stumble. The judge decided there was enough to proceed, so a future court date was scheduled. Abby shot me a glare as she left, mouthing, "You'll regret this." I expected that threat, but it still shook me a little. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, probably tipped off by some friend or family member. My parents rushed Abby past them without comment. I simply said, "All I want is justice," and left it at that. My lawyer advised me to keep a low profile, but the story spread in our local community. People started sharing their own bad experiences with Abby. She'd always been the golden girl on the surface, but a lot of resentment lurked underneath. My sister's squeaky clean image was beginning to crack. I was finally seeing her lose control, and it felt oddly gratifying. As the case progressed, Abby's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal. He suggested a reduced charge if I agreed to drop any demand for jail time or a hefty fine. My lawyer relayed the offer, but I refused. I wanted Abby to face the consequences of her actions. She came to see me one afternoon without warning, showing up at my apartment door with tear-streaked cheeks and a quiver in her voice. She said, "Can we talk?" I almost didn't let her in, but curiosity got the better of me. She sat on the edge of my couch, claiming she was sorry, that she never meant to hurt me so badly. I watched her face, searching for sincerity, but it felt staged, like she was reading from a script. After a moment, she slipped in the real reason she came. "Mom and Dad say if this goes to trial, they'll cut us both off. How about we find a way to settle this quietly?" That set me off. I told her to get out, that I wasn't dropping anything. She glared at me, real venom in her eyes, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. If she'd hoped to manipulate me, she failed. A few days later, my parents called to deliver an ultimatum. Drop the charges immediately or be disowned. I had to remind myself not to waver. I told them I'd made my decision. My mother started sobbing, calling me ungrateful. My father took the phone and spat out, "Don't expect a penny from us." I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't regret. It was mourning the relationship I never truly had with them. The next time I met with my lawyer, I told her about my parents' threats. She wasn't surprised. She said it often happens in family disputes where money is used as leverage. I realized my parents never saw me as their child, just another investment they could control. I wondered if they'd always been like this, or if Abby's birth somehow changed their priorities. Either way, I wasn't bending. We prepared for the upcoming trial. Abby would face criminal charges for assault, and I was determined to see it through. My entire body still hurt from that fall, and I'd never forget how close I came to permanent injury. This was bigger than money. This was about my dignity and sense of self-worth. The trial date finally arrived. The courtroom was crowded, with a few reporters, family acquaintances, and even strangers who'd caught wind of the story. Abby walked in, wearing a conservative dress, feigning meekness, and glanced over at me with a mix of hatred and fear. My parents sat behind her, their expressions stony. My lawyer presented a strong case, citing medical documents, witness testimonies, and even video footage from someone's phone at the party that showed Abby pushing me down the stairs. The defense tried to argue it was horseplay, that we'd both been drinking, but toxicology reports showed I had no alcohol in my system. Abby's side used every trick they could, painting me as a vindictive sibling jealous of her success. But the evidence was clear. Abby physically assaulted me, and my injuries were severe enough to warrant more than a slap on the wrist. When the jury deliberated, I remember clutching Dylan's hand, feeling both terrified and strangely calm. After several tense hours, they came back with a guilty verdict on a lesser charge of misdemeanor assault, but it still carried penalties. Abby looked like she might faint when she heard it. My parents glared at me, their faces twisted in rage. The sentencing hearing was a week later. Abby received community service, probation, and mandatory counseling. Some might think that punishment was light, but for her, it was devastating. She'd never had a blemish on her record before. Now it would follow her for years. She rushed out of the courtroom in tears. My parents didn't even look at me. I stepped outside into the hallway, feeling a strange blend of triumph and emptiness. Dylan asked if I was okay. I nodded, but deep down, I realized nothing could fix the damage done to my family. Then again, maybe there was never much of a family to begin with. Abby was forced to pay restitution for my medical bills, which eased my financial burden. After all those years of seeing her get away with everything, it felt good to watch her face some real consequences. That night, I went home, quietly made myself dinner, and let the reality sink in. I had won the case, but lost the last fragments of my relationship with my parents. Strangely, I felt more liberated than ever before. I had stood my ground and made sure Abby couldn't hurt me again. That was worth everything. In the weeks following the trial, I discovered my parents had indeed cut me out of their will. They sold the idea to their friends that I'd betrayed the family, airing our dirty laundry in public. Some relatives sided with them, but a few sent me private messages saying they understood why I did it. I realized I was done seeking their approval. Abby, forced into counseling, apparently blamed me for everything wrong in her life. Her friends were now cautious around her, and her job prospects took a hit because of the assault record. I heard she was struggling with community service hours and complaining nonstop. She never once reached out to apologize sincerely. She only posted cryptic social media updates about how she was the victim of a vindictive sibling. My parents continued doting on her, covering her legal fees, and probably still blaming me. But I didn't care. I was free from their manipulation. Though my wrist still ached and my scars remained, I felt stronger, more confident in myself. Revenge had tasted sweet, but it was also a harsh reminder that this was the family I was born into. Now, I was choosing a different path. But she shoved me down a flight of stairs with zero remorse. She tried to twist it into my fault. My parents threatened me instead of comforting me. I did what I had to do. I pressed charges, I fought in court, and I won. Now I walk with my head held higher. I've adjusted to life without my parents' financial safety net. Dylan helped me set up a new living arrangement, and I found better work opportunities elsewhere. I cut off contact with my parents and Abby, blocked their numbers, and focused on healing, physically and emotionally. The last I heard, Abby was struggling to keep up with her mandated counseling sessions. Maybe they'll do her some good. Or maybe she'll just keep blaming me. Either way, I find comfort in knowing she didn't get away with it this time. I stood up for myself, and no matter how they spin it, I don't regret a single thing.